The first question to Dr. Butler. Four classes of drug, intolerance, how would you tease out? I think what you said earlier, I think you need to repeat that.
Yeah, so the intolerance is a real issue. So if the intolerance is related to blood pressure or hypotension, there are very simple tricks we can do. One is that low dose is good, high dose is better, but let not the high dose be the enemy of low dose, at least give low dose. Two, don't give all the medications right at the same time, space them out, give something at 8 in the morning and something at noon so that everybody's thing is not causing hypotension. Three, look at the drugs that the patient doesn't need. For instance, if they are on amlodipine or nitrates or something like that, you can stop that. Four, adjust your diuretic dose. Give them a little bit of volume and they'll tolerate their blood pressure. But when all else fails, at least low dose is good. So that's one thing. Bradycardia, well, if your heart rate is in the 60s, that's great. You reach a therapeutic dose. You don't need to go up on the dose of beta blocker. Hyperkalemia, again, get rid of the offending agents, things like NSAIDs and all that kind of stuff. And then remember, we have really good potassium binders now, patiromer and sodium zirconium cyclosilicate, but a lot of the patients will be able to tolerate it with SGLT2 inhibitor and MRA. And let's see what happens with the novel MRAs, the more selective one with lower risk of hyperkalemia. So there's a lot of tricks we can do for intolerance before giving up.
So can I inject a note of reality as a general cardiologist who practices heart failure without a license? Okay, I read your commentary with Greg in JAMA Cardiology, and I actually suggested that, as I'm an editor of Cardiology Today, that we do a roundtable. So if you get the invitation from Carl Pepin, it's from me. But, you know, you can't do this on hospitalized patients, and I'll tell you why. It's because the nurse will hold the beta blocker at 2 a.m. because the heart rate drops to 44 in a person who's totally asymptomatic, gets up, walks around, has perfect heart rate response. But the nursing will hold the medicine. And, you know, it's a bane of my existence. And then the house staff will hold the therapy because the creatinine is increasing before you've decongested the patient. And I have these battles where I say, look, if the creatinine goes up, it's a good thing. But I have a terrible struggle with the house staff with that. And then blood pressure. You know, I don't care if the patient's blood pressure is 88, if when they stand up after dangling, they're okay. But again, the nurses and the house staff get all jittery about this. So in the real world, it's extremely difficult to do what you're saying.
So my wife is a general practitioner, and she frequently reminds me that I should not feel too good about myself because I tend to know one disease, and there are people who takes care of more than one disease, and they don't have the same. So she brings me down to reality quite a lot. I mean, the only thing that I can say is that I'm sort of very sympathetic because the self-efficacy comes from two things. One is if you do the same thing over and over again, you develop a little bit more confidence, but it's actually beyond the confidence. Partly we are able to do what we do is because we have nurses that are also trained to do the same thing, and we have a whole infrastructure and a team that is able to do that. In my opinion, at least at this point, heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, I mean, I just talked about 4 therapies. There are 3 or 4 more other drugs for specific cases and devices. I think it's big enough problem, it's expensive enough problem, and it's complex enough problem that at least the bigger hospitals should have dedicated heart failure teams. It is not realistic to expect that every nurse on night shift will start feeling comfortable and will become a heart failure expert.
Yeah, but to save those 100,000 lives, we've got to have some practical implementation program that doesn't involve a heart failure service with dedicated NPs and the stuff that you guys have at your behest.
A question for Dr. Libby. Considering the data between inflammatory infection and thrombosis/ischemia, is it safe to conclude that type 2 MI is perhaps not benign and should elicit further coronary evaluation and treatment?
I'm sorry, what's not benign? There's an echo here. It's hard to hear.
Pardon?
What's not benign?
The type 2 MI.
Oh, no. I mean, type 2 MI is myocardial injury, and the issue is we need to figure out what the triggering mechanisms are and treat that. So that's what we do on the consultation service day in and day out on general surgical service, on the surgical specialties, general surgery, and on the general medicine. we're stamping out troponin. That's probably about 40% of our business on the consultation service, and it's, you know, it's the usual list of things, and that's what we do as cardiologists, is to try to deal with those precipitating factors. I spoke about infection as one, but you all know the list of things that are going to drive type 2, and the issue is trying to prevent it from happening rather than trying to put out the fire once it's lit.
Thank you. People are raising the question of ELARA, Dr. Leipzig, and also asking that what is the role of CTA in intermediate risk and STEMIs?
So I think the question about ELARA as low as reasonably achievable is highly important, and everything I shared with you really reflected the use of CT in symptomatic patients. Obviously, the issue of screening for what is the most common cause of death, disease that we've learned so much about, and yet don't necessarily have a meaningful screening program in place. We don't have any evidence right now to screen with CTA in an asymptomatic population. We have a trial that's underway called SCOT-HEART-2, being led by David Newby as well, which will certainly inform us and provide us some insight as to whether or not there's an opportunity to refine risk and improve outcomes in such patients. But I think that's really important to appreciate. Everything I shared with you is really in the setting of a symptomatic patient who's requiring workup or is undergoing a valve procedure. In that context, I think CTA can be done safely and reasonably, but I think it is also important to reflect on the fact that if we want to do things like plaque quantification, even without tracking it, we need to use scan parameters that meet the requirements of that challenge. And that doesn't necessarily mean dropping the dose to the lowest level possible, but the lowest level possible to allow us to do what we need to do to provide accurate diagnosis and prognosis. And so that's been certainly a shift over the last few years where perhaps the pendulum had swung too far. And then finally, the second question was on, you mentioned ELARA and then...
and STEMIs.
And STEMIs, sorry. So we know the Europeans have given a class 1 support for the selective use of CT. We use high sensitivity troponins for the last 5 years in Vancouver. We use it largely for low to intermediate gray score with gray zone troponin levels. We saw in rapid CCTA, which was recently done in Edinburgh, that if you go too far with the use of CT, it's not going to help. If you do it in patients with known disease, it's not going to help. If you do it in very high-risk patients, it's not going to help. But I think in selected patients, as we saw in a trial called Verdict, it can help rationalize the use of catheterization, triage patients for with regards to the urgency of catheterization, and it can avoid catheterization in a significant number of patients safely and cost-effectively, but again, thoughtfully.
Thank you. And this is a very interesting question for Dr. Libby. Given that the inflammation could start very early, even if the atherosclerosis may not have set in, what do you think would be the age which would be too young to commit a patient to statins, and what would be the age that should be considered too old to keep the patients on meds?
Yeah. So the first point is it's lifestyle. I mean, we need to, as a society, have bicycle lanes. We need to restore physical education to schools. We need to get the sugar-sweetened beverages out of the school. We need to have healthier nutrition. And I'm just channeling what Valentin would say if he were here. I think that I've written this in the past, that it's a colossal societal failure that we're discussing giving statins to 8-year-olds, which is what was in one of the American Academy of Pediatric statements some years ago. But I think, again, what Valentin showed was the Amit Kara's study. So we can do a polygenic risk score. We're all going to have our exome sequence, probably our whole genome sequencing, and have it on a little chip somewhere that Bill Gates will put in our skin. And we'll be able to tell from birth the crystal ball of someone's cardiovascular risk. Those that are on the low end, we can do lifestyle, lifestyle, lifestyle. Those that are on the higher end, we may begin thinking about targeting therapies at an earlier age. We'll never have a randomized clinical trial about giving a 14-year-old statins, right? But I think we're going to have to harness the emerging genetics, and that study of Amit Kara shows that lifestyle behaviors can modify that genetic risk. So the way that I write, if anyone is a reviewer of my program Project Grant, I hope you'll read this beautiful literary statement where I say that your genetics, what you inherit from mom or dad, is the sketch on the canvas of cardiovascular risk. But the full portrait depends on how we conduct ourselves and our exposures.
How you paint it.
Thank you. So, and then again, two very interesting questions which come. One for Dr. Butler and one for Dr. Leipzig. For Dr. Butler, what do you do about the medications after the heart failure with recovered ejection fraction?
Yeah, this debate comes that if your heart failure has recovered, do you need therapy for the rest of your life because you don't have heart failure, or has it recovered because of the medication, and if you were to stop medications, then your heart failure would get worse. So I think most heart failure doctors had anecdotes that you stop the medication and then the EF would come back. Now we actually have a randomized controlled trial, very small, came out in Lancet called TREAD-HF, where people who had recovered EF, when you stop the medication, it starts coming down, the ejection fraction comes down again, and there is no guarantee that reintroducing the medication, the ejection fraction will go up again. So I make one exception to this rule, but by and large, you're committed to the therapy for life. The only exception that I make is that if there is a disease in which the natural history is such that the LV may recover, so if you have a postpartum cardiomyopathy, a 21-year-old female, and then the heart function totally recovers, do you really want the therapy forever? Probably not. So you just sort of take one medicine down, check an echo, the other one down, check an echo, and just very closely follow. But other than that, it's pretty much life therapy.
Dr. Leipzig, how rare is non-calcific plaque in patients with no traditional cardiovascular risk factor? And do we give a free pass to those with zero calcium score, and for how long?
So we've actually looked at that in the CONFIRM registry, about 40,000 patients, and what we find is that independent of modifiable cardiovascular risk factors, that atherosclerosis obviously depends on age, as we've seen from lots of other studies, but it's not infrequent that we'll find plaque despite that, and that plaque predicts risk. In other words, if the extent and severity of coronary disease, independent of modifiable risk factors, is a driver of risk, not surprisingly. You can't run from your atherosclerosis, so to speak. So I think what we do know is that CTA really personalizes the individual risk by identifying the extent and severity. As it relates to the calcium score, again, I think it depends on, you're looking at an asymptomatic population. What we've seen fairly consistently is the time to conversion is roughly 5 years. We saw that from Jim Min in 2010 in JACC, and we saw that actually recently in a very elegant study looking at the divergence between, or the conversion time. Usually it's 5 years, and when there is conversion to positivity, the patients that do convert to have calcium do worse than those who remain calcium-free. Obviously, that's the relative risk, and how often you continue to check depends. I think one of the real challenges we have with CT is that we don't have good nomograms based on the number of segments of atherosclerosis for age. We have them obviously in observational sense, but we saw that very elegant work that was just published in JAMA, was it JAMA, just a couple of weeks ago, the observational large study that looked at the prevalence of atherosclerosis, which was obviously very sobering. And that's why we need to, coming back to Dr. Libby's comments, it seems like looking for it that late is a missed opportunity.
So thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the session, and I would specifically like to mention if Dr. Lyron Blum is here. Some very interesting questions that were asked. So thank you very much for that. And I think we should be here at 11:35, Dr. Sharma, because we will promptly start at 11:40 with a lecture from our ACC Vice President, Dr. Ed Fry. So thank you very much, and grateful, Dr. Butler, Dr. Libby, and Dr. Leipzig.
Honored, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.